All right, guys, welcome back to Thoughtful Theology. As always, I appreciate you being here. So today I'm going to do the second video in the series, Obscure Theological Doctrines That Might Be True. And quickly, just to explain a little bit what I mean and what the purpose of this series is. So the first part, Obscure Theological Doctrines. So this is just to shed light on some lesser known theological ideas or doctrines that most people are not going to be aware of. You know, your average lay Christian is not going to know what open theism is, and that's perfectly fine. I wouldn't expect them to know unless you sort of are deeper in theological study, and not everybody is. That's okay. I think we should all be theologians, but it doesn't mean by studying the Bible that you're necessarily going to come on to a nuanced topic like this. So that's kind of the point of this series, is to take some lesser known doctrines that people aren't familiar with and then maybe shed some light on them so people can sort of make decisions about them that way. And you can't reject something that you don't understand, and so it's at least worth understanding these positions. And then so that second part might be true. So I want to be clear. I don't necessarily think open theism is true. I'm not convinced of it, but I'm not convinced enough by the other positions to reject it, right? So, I mean, your main three positions here, well, there'd be four if you include Calvinism, but I definitely reject Calvinism. But on this topic of divine foreknowledge and free will, there's sort of Arminian there's probably some other ones, but three main positions at his disposal, and that would be your Molinist position, your simple foreknowledge position, and your open theist position. And so, of all these views, I'm not really sure which one. I'm sort of agnostic as to which one is correct. I'm open to all. Maybe I'm 33% convinced by the three of them. So I think they're all possible. I don't know. I just know, I do believe that humans have free will, and I think that God is omniscient. So one of these positions must be right. And so anyways, this is just a fun series where I can take a position where people maybe aren't familiar with, and then we can kind of shed light on it. We can kind of speculate. We can kind of sort of steelman it. We can defend it in a way as though it were right, and then see what you think, see what your responses are. Like I said, it's always good to know and understand the other side of any position. So on this topic, I'm sure most people will reject it. That's perfectly fine. But you need to know what it is you're rejecting and then why it is you're rejecting it. So these are just kind of fun videos for me. And okay, so quickly, let's kind of get into defining open theism. And open theism just means, right, the point of that is that the future is truly open, right? That God does not know future free actions of creatures. And now here's the important part, right? If you remember nothing else, maybe this might be the most important thing to take away from this video. Open theists are still going to affirm that God is omniscient, right? And to be omniscient is that just God knows all true propositions. So God knows all true things. The simple way we look at it is just God knows all the future, right? Our free will decisions, just everything. And so a lot of times the first big pushback here would be, well, open theists sort of reject God's omniscience because they say he doesn't know the future actions of free creatures. And while that's true, it actually does not ultimately, right, at least if you're convinced by this, it doesn't ultimately lead to that conclusion, because open theists do affirm God's omniscience, right? They affirm that God is all-knowing, and so that God knows all things. And how they sort of get around this is they make the argument that future free actions of creatures is something that is in principle unknowable. And now you might say something like, oh, well, okay, so you're saying there's something like God can't do. Well, here is a good comparison. So traditionally, all Christian philosophers, Christian theologians affirm that God is omnipotent, right? That just means all powerful. But they reject this idea that God could, let's say, create a square circle. And the reason why we do this is because creating a square circle is a logically incoherent idea, right? It's you can say it in a sentence, right? And it seems like there's some sensibility, but it's essentially a contradiction in terms, right? A square by definition has four sides. A circle by definition has no sides. So it just cannot be the case that this thing, such as a square circle, could ever exist in principle because it's logically incoherent. So Christians, from the beginning of time, have acknowledged this point that yes, when we say God's um, omnipotent, it doesn't entail that he can do logically contradictory things, because logically contradictory things aren't actually things to do. They're just in principle unsensible. And so that's the same move that the open theist is sort of making here regarding omniscience, that future free actions of free creatures are just in principle unknowable. So they're not rejecting that there's something God can't do. They're just rejecting, like the omnipotence thing, they are just rejecting here that knowing future free actions is even a coherent idea at all. And sort of to defend this quickly, I don't want to spend a ton of time here. The point is just that if a person is truly free in the future, right, then it's just impossible to know even what they're going to do, because they themselves don't know what they're going to do, not now or not even in that moment, right? That's the whole point of a free will decision, is that you have this way you can go right or left, and in that moment there is truly the possibility of going either way. And so it doesn't become a fact of the matter that Bob will go right until that decision is made. And so that's the, again, the most important thing here. Whether you think that argument is valid or works out is another thing, but they are not rejecting God's omniscience. They're just putting these future free actions in the category of being unknowable things, like God creating a square circle. So they can also at the same time affirm God's omniscience. And so now, moving on from there, I think it's always good here, right? We talk about the philosophy and things of that nature, but it's also important to talk about the exegetical basis, right? The scriptural warrant for that. So I've got some verses here I just want to read. I'm not going to read a ton, because the point isn't to give an exhaustive scriptural defense, but it's at least to show why open theists go to scripture and they say, hey, wait a minute, there's a lot of verses here that really seem to indicate that God doesn't know the future. And so if that's the case, we want to look at these verses, because I agree wholeheartedly. As much as I like philosophy, if somebody comes up with a position that's very pretty and flowery philosophically, but if there's just no warrant in scripture, then we need to reject that position. And so let's just look at some of these verses here. So I'm going to pull one up here. And so this is kind of an example of, it's Exodus 32:14. And here's an example of where it says God changes his mind, right? And the idea here is if God sort of knows what's going to happen in the future, then there's not ever going to be a need for him to change his mind. So this idea of him changing his mind seems to be that he's sort of acting in time with these creatures based upon their decisions of what they make. And so the verse says, so the Lord changed his mind about the harm which he said he would do to his people. So there's just an idea of saying he's changing his mind. Here's an example of God regretting what he did, and everybody's going to know this one. Genesis 6:6, it says, and the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. I think one translation, this is the NASB, actually says that he regrets, but maybe not. That might not be true. But the same idea here, that the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth. It sounds like God's saying, man, maybe this wasn't a good idea, right? Even though open theist, though, to be fair quickly here, affirms that God knows sort of all possibilities, right? Anytime something happens, God isn't ever taken fully by surprise, maybe in the way that we are. But this seems to be a verse where God's sort of did something, and now he's kind of regretting it. Well, if he knew the future, it wouldn't make any sense for him to say that he sort of regrets doing this. Let's look at some other ones. So this is kind of in the topic of God maybe not knowing what somebody might do. Let's see here. Okay. Here we go. This is Jeremiah 7:31. And they have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, and it did not come into my mind. Well, this is a good verse for multiple reasons when we're talking about like the problem of evil, that God is so far removed from such evil atrocities that, first of all, he's saying, I did not command it, which is clear. He said, this thing wouldn't even sort of come into my mind. God is so far apart from evil, especially the evil actions of humans, that this thing wouldn't even enter into his mind. And so, but anyways, on the topic of this video, is that says it did not even come into my mind, meaning again, God didn't really expect for these people to do this thing, right? In this case, it was such a bad thing that it didn't even enter into God's mind, maybe, that they would even do such a thing. It was so bad. Okay, let's maybe look at one or a couple more here. So here is from Genesis 22:12, and it says, and he said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So this is, everybody knows this from the Abraham story, where he's going to go up and sacrifice Isaac. God is seemingly saying in this verse that, okay, this was sort of a test for Abraham, and now he knows, right? He knows that Abraham was going to be faithful in doing this. And so if you say, now I know, it seems to imply the fact that prior to this moment now, that God did not know. And I know you open theist rejectors, which is, partially me. I am going to sort of provide some pushback here at the end, especially for these verses. Okay, one more here. Okay. So this is from Exodus 4:9, and it says, but it shall be that if they will not believe, so it's if they, right? God's sort of expressing uncertainty about how these humans are going to act, how they're going to respond to this. If they will not believe in these two signs or heed what you say, then you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water which you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. So again, the important part here is that first part, but it shall be that if they will not believe, right? So God's leaving open the possibility that they may believe, that they may not believe. And so seemingly like he doesn't know, right? And so this, again, there's a lot more of these verses, but this sort of at least lays a framework, right? Lays the groundwork for why somebody can go to Scripture and say, hey, it seems to me like there is this real issue of God not knowing the future, not knowing how people are going to respond or what they're going to do. And so this is sort of why open theism does have the followers that it does. And then when you combine that into conjunction with, I'm going to go into quickly a philosophical argument for it, which is, okay, let's take Bob. Let's say Bob at 5 p.m. tomorrow will order the steak. Okay. So now let's say 5 p.m. comes around, because God knows with perfect knowledge, perfect foreknowledge, right? If you're rejecting the open theist position, right? This is a criticism of the non-open theist positions as to why they should that position is wrong. And so here's sort of how it goes, as simplified as possible. Bob will order the steak at 5 p.m. Okay, so the day before, Bob may not know that he will order the steak at 5 p.m. The next day comes, and as Bob sits down and he grabs the menu and he glosses over all the great options, he's got the chicken, he's got the shrimp, he's got the steak. He's really wrestling with, man, should I eat this? This chicken looks great. Oh, but I had steak last night. And so Bob's really going through it, right? Bob is experiencing free will. And lo and behold, server comes around and Bob orders a steak. Now the question becomes, if Bob ever really had free will, then in that instance, if the fact that he would choose steak at 5 p.m. was already settled beforehand. Now, the point that Molinists or simple foreknowledge adherents are going to point out at this point is they're going to say that knowledge is not causal, right? And this is, again, where I'm kind of in the middle, where I see both sides, which is why I haven't made a decision. But the pushback here is, well, God's knowledge, even prior, right, that day before, that God knows that Bob will choose the steak at 5 p.m., God's knowledge is dependent on the free will action of Bob, right? It's not the other way around. It's not that Bob's action is dependent on God's knowledge, right? God has to, his knowledge has to be based on something. So the idea here is that knowledge isn't causal, right? Let's just say a simpler example. Let's say you know that your brother is going to wear a LeBron James jersey to school tomorrow, right? Because he's got it laid out. He told you, or you just know that he is. But somehow, you knowing that he's going to wear that jersey doesn't undermine his freedom to not wear the jersey. Now that's not always the best example, because in the case of God, this knowledge is infallible; it cannot be wrong. Or in the case of humans, but this is just sort of to highlight how knowing something ahead of time doesn't mean that your knowledge causes it, right? Your knowledge is based on the person's doing something. Um, so that's the pushback. But that's not always that convincing, right? There's other ways to frame this. Even if we grant that, it still seems odd, right? If when 5 p.m. rolls around, if God knows prior to Bob choosing the steak, um, that he's going to choose the steak, then it just seems, right? Intuitively, it seems that Bob's not free at 5 p.m. to actually choose anything other than the steak, because then God's knowledge would be wrong. And another pushback there from the other side would be that, well, if Bob would have chosen something different, God's knowledge would be different. Um, but operating in time as we do, there just seems to still be this problem that, okay, well, if God knows the day before that Bob's going to eat steak, then when that moment rolls around to actually make the decision, right, when God's sort of or when Bob's experiencing this pull to steak and chicken, then it seems like Bob's not actually free to choose anything other than the steak, because that would mean that God's knowledge was wrong. And so that's kind of the idea here. So the point here is just that if God has this foreknowledge, then it takes away humans' free will. And the Bible is clear, seemingly clear, that God has, or that God has given mankind free will. And so it just seems that maybe that the thing to do then is to reject this idea of God knowing future free actions of free creatures, because then free will is sort of left intact, and um, we can still say that God's omniscience is left intact, because these free will decisions are just something that are in principle unknowable, um, like God creating a square circle. So I keep saying that because that's so important, because most people are going to say, yes, God is omnipotent, but he can't do logically contradictory things. That's all the open theist is doing, making the same move, saying God is omniscient, but he can't know logically contradictory things, which would be the future free actions of free creatures. So anyways, I think I'm going to leave it at that. I'm trying to keep these videos around 20 minutes or less. So yeah, I don't know. Let me know what you think. Like I said, this isn't necessarily my position. I'm open to it. I think there's definitely some perks to it. I think you can make a scriptural argument for it, for sure. Okay, quickly. The pushback on those verses is going to be from the other side. Is going to be that this is sort of anthropomorphic language, right? And that's just a fancy way of saying this is God speaking to creatures in a way that they can sort of relate to. So when God says, "Oh, I was grieved that I made man," it's really just a way for God to express his displeasure in the people, right? In their behavior and in the things that they chose to do. It doesn't necessarily mean that God literally, right, grieved or repented or changed his mind or regretted. It just means that this is a way for God, who is divine. God is infinite. Um, you know, this is a way for God that's so different from humans, right? He's infinite. We're finite. It's just a way for God to sort of relay ideas and messages to people in a way that's simple for them to understand. And so that's the pushback there. And so maybe you find that convincing, maybe you don't. There are certain verses where I think that's really hard to actually make work. I think there's instances where it seems like, okay, so if this is just anthropomorphic language, that I'm not really sure what human message, right, he's really trying to convey. Off the top of my head, I don't have that, but it's at least something to think about when you're looking over these verses. If this anthropomorphic language thing is a adequate response, then every open theist verse, you're gonna have to make sure that sort of checks out. And so, anyways, yeah, this has been fun. I'm probably going to continue on to those reaction videos next, but I want to continue in these other video series that I've been doing. So as always, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, leave ideas for future videos in the comment. That would be fun. I don't know, sometimes I don't always have ideas, so that would be cool to get ideas from you guys, and if I like it, maybe I'll do it. So anyways, till next time, see you guys.